There is a repeating sequence in economic history that has wrecked three major national economies in the last 100 years. And here in 2025, we are tracing that same sequence line for line, digit for digit, as if we are following the very manual that ended in catastrophe every previous time. In 1923, Germany followed it. Their paper money decayed into wallpaper. A loaf of bread hit 200 billion marks. Employers paid wages twice a day because by lunchtime half the purchasing power had vanished. Lifetimes of savings disappeared in days. The middle class was erased. In 2008, Zimbabwe ran the same play. They printed a $100 trillion note that couldn't cover a bus fare. Annual inflation reached 89.76%, followed by 21 zeros. Prices doubled roughly every 24 hours. The currency didn't just weaken, it died. In 2018, Venezuela repeated the pattern. Average people lost 24 pounds because food was unaffordable. Doctors turned to prostitution to eat. The currency lost 99.9% of its value in 5 years. A country with the largest oil reserves on Earth plunged into full economic collapse. 3 countries, 3 complete currency failures. The same sequence each time. And here's the part that should alarm you. Since 2020, the United States and central banks around the world have created more money than all 3 of those countries combined before their collapses. We are not only on the same path, we have pressed the accelerator. This is a roadmap for how nations ruin their currencies, why leaders always insist their case is different, and why the arithmetic points to us next. Before we lay out the steps, you need to see what hyperinflation means in lived experience, not in theory, but on the street when money dies. The formal threshold is inflation above 50% per month. That translates to prices doubling every 30 days. When it bites, it moves faster. In the worst phases, prices double daily, then hourly. Picture this. You start work on Monday morning. Your pay hits the account at noon. By 5 p.m., a third of that purchasing power has evaporated. The grocery store has changed tags twice since lunch. The gas station edits the marquee each hour. You race to swap cash for anything real before your notes turn into dead paper. Everyone else is racing too. Shelves empty within hours. The bills in your pocket feel like burning coals. You must get rid of them now, because tomorrow they buy half as much. The savings you built for 30 years disappear in weeks. Pensions become meaningless. Insurance pays out in bills that won't cover dinner. Bonds turn into waste paper. Anyone who trusted the system, saved in the national currency, and followed the rules, loses everything. That is not a thought experiment. That is Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. And it happened because governments tried to print their way through problems that printing cannot solve, while convincing themselves the danger could not reach them. Here is how it unfolded 3 times, via the same logic. Begin with the first modern hyperinflation, Weimar Germany, 1923. This is the template. Everything after has echoed it. After World War I, Germany faced reparations fixed at 132 billion gold marks, about 50,000 tons of gold, roughly $1.4 trillion in current dollars. Germany did not have it. War damage crushed production. Unemployment soared. Tax income collapsed. The government confronted a stark choice: default and risk occupation, or print money to try to pay. They printed. That is where every hyperinflation begins. A state that cannot or will not live within its revenue. At first, the expansion looked manageable. Beginning in 1919, the Reichsbank grew the money supply. Prices rose, but not to apocalyptic levels. Officials said it was temporary, necessary to rebuild, trust the plan. By 1921, the dollar traded around 60 marks. Bad, but survivable. Then came 1922. France occupied the Ruhr Germany's industrial core to force payments Germany could not make. Workers went on strike. Output halted. The government continued paying strikers with newly printed paper more and more. That was the acceleration phase, the tipping point. By year end, a dollar cost 7,400 marks. Many still believed authorities had control. They did not. The printing had crossed the line from policy to self-destruction. In 1923, the failure appeared in full view. January, 17,000 marks per dollar. July, 350,000. August, 4.6 million. October, 25 billion. November, 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Translate that into daily life. In January 1923, bread cost 250 marks. By November, the same loaf cost 200 billion. One egg cost 80 billion. A kilo of butter, if you could find it, cost 6 trillion. Firms paid wages twice a day. People ran to spend at lunch before afternoon, destroyed the value. Restaurants reprinted prices mid-meal. Wheelbarrows transported cash, not wealth. Families burned notes for heat because it was cheaper than wood. The middle class was demolished. Savers and marks lost everything. Anyone on fixed income pensions, wages, coupons was wiped out overnight. Social trust snapped, crime surged, extremists flourished. Out of that collapse came the Nazis. Hyperinflation did not only crush currency, it ripped apart society, corroded confidence in the state and markets, and darkened expectations of the future. Germany vowed never again. 85 years later, another nation reenacted the script. Zimbabwe in the 2000s had infrastructure, an educated populace, and robust farm exports. The breadbasket of Africa. Then the Mugabe government made choices that destroyed the economy in under a decade. In 2000, white-owned farms were seized and redistributed. Output collapsed, exports ended, GDP shrank, tax collections fell. The government faced the same decision Germany faced. Cut to fit revenue or print to fill gaps. They printed. By 2003, inflation hit 600%. Terrible, but not yet terminal. Officials said it was temporary. They blamed sanctions and outsiders, never the presses. By 2006, inflation ran at 200%. The Reserve Bank kept issuing money to pay salaries, the military, and projects the state could not afford. Then came the acceleration. In 2007, inflation hit 100,000%. Shelves emptied, factories shut, people fled. The response? More printing and price controls. That always makes it worse. Producers cannot sell at a loss, so supply disappears. Black market prices explode. In 2008, Zimbabwe entered history's extreme. January, 100,000% inflation. April, 150,000%. June, 11 million%. By July, official statistics ceased. Economists estimated 89.76% with 21 zeros on an annualized basis. In plain terms, prices doubled about every 24 hours. A soda costing 1 Zimbabwe dollar on Monday was 2 on Tuesday, 4 on Wednesday, 8 on Thursday. By the next Monday, it was 128 one week, 128 times higher. The Reserve Bank issued a 100 trillion note. Not a misprint. It would not buy 3 eggs. People abandoned the currency entirely. They bartered. They used US dollars or South African rand, anything but Zimbabwe dollars. GDP fell by 50%. Unemployment reached 94%. The average person lost 24 pounds for lack of food. Life expectancy plunged from 60 to 34 in a decade. Cholera outbreaks spread. Infrastructure collapsed. Society broke. In 2009, Zimbabwe discarded its currency. They had printed it to death. The Zimbabwe dollar, once stronger than the US. Dollar disappeared. Savers in local currency lost everything. Decades of work gone. Again, the outside world claimed it could not happen to them. Zimbabwe was aberrant, uniquely corrupt. It was not unique. It was the same pattern. 10 years later, another country proved it again. Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia was in 2001. The wealthiest country in South America by GDP per capita, boasting universal health care, free education, and a functioning democracy. Then Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro made the same choices common to hyperinflation, huge expansions of social spending, absent revenue, nationalizations, price controls, and when taxes could not fund the outlays, printing filled the gap. From 2012 to 2017, money supply grew 14,000%, not 14%, 14,000. The central bank ran the presses to cover spending and deficits. By 2016, inflation was 800%. Stores emptied. Leaders blamed hoarding, speculators, economic war, never the issuance. Price controls forced sales below cost, so production halted. Supply evaporated. In 2017, inflation hit 2,600%. People ate from trash. Zoos lost animals, later found butchered for meat. Hospitals lacked basics. The grid failed regularly. The believer was dying, yet printing continued. In 2018, the collapse sped up. Inflation reached 1.3 million%, then 2.6 million, with estimates near 10 million before year-end. At that tempo, a carton of eggs priced at 200 bolívares in January cost 200 million in December. The state printed a 1,000 bolívar note. Within months, it would not buy coffee. 5 zeros were removed in 2018 with the sovereign bolívar. It failed. 6 more zeros were cut in 2021. That failed too. By 2019, more than 5 million Venezuelans had fled, about 7% of the population. Those who remained lost an average of 24 pounds from malnutrition. Doctors, teachers, and engineers abandoned their fields. Some turned to prostitution, many emigrated. GDP collapsed 75%, a contraction worse than the Great Depression, and deeper than Germany's post-World War II decline. Oil production, lifeblood of the economy, fell 70% due to neglected infrastructure. Today, transactions are effectively dollarized. U.S. dollars dominate, not believers. The currency they overprinted is worthless. Anyone who kept savings in bolívares and waited for stability lost everything. 3 cases: Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Different places, eras, and politics. Same pattern, same decisions, same math. And now the largest economies are making the same choices. Break the sequence down, and today becomes legible. The cycle is mechanical. A real shock hammers output and revenues. Deficits widen. Authorities face a trilemma: spending cuts, taxation, or monetary financing. Politics resists cuts, timing defeats tax hikes, and rollover risk punishes default. So issuance climbs, and central banks absorb it. Money growth outruns real production. Expectations adjust, velocity rises, and the unit of account bleeds credibility. Indexation and frequent repricing embed yesterday's inflation into tomorrow's contracts, turning a price jump into a process. As households front-load purchases and firms shrink payment terms, the demand for real balances collapses. Señorage momentarily fills the gap, then hits its Laffer limit as people dump the currency faster than the state can print it. Capital flees duration, term premia widen, and the government faces fiscal dominance, either cap rates and sacrifice the currency or defend the currency and detonate the budget via interest costs. Each temporary fixed-price controls, subsidies, directed credit, capital controls, erodes supply, shifts activity off books, and accelerates dollarization or barter. The pattern does not need panic headlines to advance. It proceeds through incentives, balance sheet math, and the erosion of trust. That is why timing is uncertain, but outcome is predictable once the loop tightens. Stage 1, the trigger. Each hyperinflation starts with a shock. Germany had reparations. Zimbabwe had agricultural collapse. Venezuela had falling oil revenues plus state controls. The shock opens a budget hole. Tax intake falls while spending commitments persist or grow. Mechanically, the base of taxable transactions shrinks while nominal obligations, wages, pensions, subsidies, debt service are sticky or indexed. External accounts worsen. Fewer exports or worse terms of trade weaken the currency, pushing up import prices and energy costs, which further compress real revenues. Automatic stabilizers, unemployment insurance transfers, switch on, while emergency outlays for security, health, or utilities expand. Collection lags bite. Taxes are assessed on stale prices, so by the time cash arrives, its real value has eroded. Meanwhile, state-owned firms running at a loss require budget support, and banks burdened by non-performing loans need liquidity. The private sector de-risks by cutting inventories and investment, which lowers future output and the tax base again, with bond buyers demanding higher yields or shorter maturities. Rollover risk grows precisely when gross financing needs spike. This is the initial asymmetry. Commitments are immediate. Revenue repair is slow. If leadership refuses to reset entitlements, liberalize supply, or restructure obligations, the gap becomes structural rather than cyclical, the seedbed in which monetization takes root. Stage 2. The choice. The government must decide: cut spending, raise taxes, default, or print to bridge the gap. Cuts are politically poisonous. Higher taxes cannot raise cash fast enough. Default threatens power. So, states print. They always print. In practice, printing means the central bank intermediates deficits, direct advances, bond purchases, or forced placement in captive balance sheets, banks, pensions, insurers. QE, yield curve control, and regulatory risk weights manufacture demand for sovereign paper at administered yields, converting duration risk into monetary-based growth. Tax hikes face elastic bases and evasion. Rate increases shrink the formal economy. One-off levies accelerate capital flight. Spending cuts collide with rigid payrolls and subsidies that anchor coalitions. Restructuring external debt invites sanctions or loss of market access. Under fiscal dominance, the central bank's reaction function bends to the Treasury's constraint. Rates cannot rise to disinflate without exploding interest costs, so monetary financing becomes the least immediate pain. To contain symptoms, policymakers add price caps, FX controls, and import licenses, which suppress signals, create shortages, and push trade to parallel markets at truer prices. Each round of financing lifts the money stock relative to goods, expectations ratchet higher, and the next budget embeds higher nominal outlays, locking in a higher starting point. What looks like a bridge becomes a road, straight into Stage 3's normalization of monetization and the self-reinforcing slide that follows. Stage 3. The justification. Authorities brand it temporary a bridge to recovery. New jargon appears. We're different. We have resources. Growth will fix it. Experts nod. Central banks endorse. The script leans on narratives: transitory spikes, base effects, supply bottlenecks, and one-off shocks, paired with promises to normalize policy once conditions allow. Forward guidance shifts from dates to data, then to flexible targets. Tolerance bands widen, redefining success as any deceleration. Models downplay money growth and fiscal dominance, recasting inflation as exogenous. Communication reframes monetization as quantitative easing, liquidity backstops, or market functioning, while fiscal outlays become targeted relief. Price caps, subsidies, and tax holidays are sold as temporary cushions, though they entrench expectations and suppress supply. Wage boards, indexation, and automatic COLA clauses are defended as fairness, but they propagate yesterday's inflation into tomorrow's contracts. Promised asset runoff stalls at the first funding stress. Temporary facilities become standing windows. External weakness is blamed on geopolitics. Internal price pressure on greedflation. The claim of credibility substitutes for credibility itself, yet survey medians drift, break-evens rise, and private balance sheets shorten duration. Each press conference buys time, but not arithmetic. By validating higher nominal spending paths and socializing losses, authorities hardwire monetization into the policy mix, converting an exception into the new baseline that propels the system into acceleration. In March 2020, a global shock arrived: COVID-19, lockdowns, frozen commerce. Governments confronted the same decision every hyperinflating regime has faced: accept pain and adjust, or print to paper it over. They printed trillions of dollars, euros, yen, and yuan. Every major central bank opened the valves. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet climbed from about $4 trillion in February 2020 to over $9 trillion by April 2022. The U.S. government spent roughly $5 trillion in COVID relief money created from nothing, dropped into accounts. The European Central Bank expanded by more than $4 trillion. The Bank of Japan continued decades of creation. China injected trillions of yuan. Everywhere, print now, worry later. And as in Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, leaders said it was temporary and necessary. We'll unwind later. Modern monetary theory says we can handle this. Inflation is transitory. Trust the experts. For a time, it looked fine. In 2020-2021, printed money levitated asset prices. Equities soared. Housing exploded. Crypto went vertical. Asset holders felt richer. The wealth effect. But by late 2021, inflation appeared. By 2022, it was undeniable. US CPI hit 9.1% in June 2022. Europe saw double digits. The UK reached levels unseen since the 1980s. Prices surged across categories: food, energy, shelter, everything. The response matched the script: blame outside forces. Putin's war, supply chains, corporate greed, never the trillions conjured from nothing. And while central banks raised rates, the base creation was not truly reversed. The Fed's balance sheet still sits above $7 trillion, roughly double pre-COVID. Government spending continued, deficits persisted, creation continued. That places us in stage 4, acceleration. We have created more in 5 years than in the prior decade. The rationalizations are familiar. The pattern is intact. The unknown is how far we push before arithmetic imposes the outcome. Check the red flags that flashed before every hyperinflationary breakdown. Explosive money supply growth? Check. US M2 rose about 40% from 2020 to 2022, unprecedented in peacetime. Outsized fiscal gaps? Check. The US ran about a $1.8 trillion deficit in 2024, over 6% of GDP during a nominal recovery. Japan's debt is roughly 260% of GDP. Healthy systems do not look like that. Persistent inflation despite claims of control? Check. Official CPI prints 3% at 4%, while actual outlays for food, rent, and insurance climb faster. Shrinkflation, substitution, and hedonic tweaks obscure reality. Asset prices unmoored from fundamentals? Check. Indexes at or near records while real wages lag and entire generations are priced out of housing. Inequality at extremes reminiscent of the 1920s. Erosion of currency faith? Check. Bitcoin exists because trust in central banks frayed. Gold prints records. BRICS members experiment with alternative rails. Foreign central banks cut dollar exposure. Cracks are everywhere. Political will for ongoing spending? Check. Each new crisis becomes justification for more outlays and more issuance. Climate, infrastructure, defense, social programs. There is always a reason. There is never an endpoint. Germany expected to stop after reparations. Zimbabwe after land reform stabilized. Venezuela after oil bounced. None stopped. Because once the presses start, stopping forces confrontation with the consequences, and no government volunteers for collapse. The pattern is here. We are following it. The only open questions are speed and severity. 3 times in the last century, large economies traced this path. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Each claimed to be different, each lost to the math. You cannot print prosperity. You cannot conjure wealth out of nothing. And you cannot delay the consequences of monetary expansion indefinitely. The invoice always arrives. Only the date is unknown. What determines that date is not speeches or forecasts, but mechanics. Persistent fiscal gaps funded with central bank credit. A money stock that outruns real output. Rising velocity as households rush to exchange cash for goods. And the feedback of indexed wages and administered prices. Once expectations shift from prices will cool to prices will keep rising, the private sector shortens pricing horizons, firms reprice more often, labor bargains for catch-up, and the spiral tightens. Capital flees, duration risk, term, premiums rise, refinancing costs jump, and deficits worsen, even before recession hits. At that point, policymakers face fiscal dominance, raise rates and compound the interest bill, or cap yields and concede the currency. Either branch preserves the pattern. Financial repression, caps, quotas, captive demand can hide symptoms, not the arithmetic underneath. When savings vehicles lose real value and the unit of account stops storing purchasing power, the middle of society abandons the currency first in behavior, inventory hoarding, dollar invoicing, and then in law. That is how the time axis compresses from years to quarters, and finally to weeks. Since 2020, the major economies have created more money than those 3 hyperinflation cases did before their collapses. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China have all run the same playbook that failed 3 times already. We are told this time is different. We have better tools, better economists, better models. We can manage it. That is exactly what officials said in Weimar, in Zimbabwe, and in Venezuela, until the day the currency broke. The comfort rests on models that treat money growth, fiscal stance, and expectations as separable. In practice, they bind. Quantitative easing, inflated public and private balance sheets. Reversing it exposes duration and liquidity fragilities. So, tightening stalls before restoring price stability. Meanwhile, structural deficits persist. Automatic stabilizers expand in downturns, and interest costs compound on a larger base, locking in higher issuance. Governments then search for one-off programs, temporary subsidies, price caps, and windfall taxes. Each distorts supply, compresses margins, and invites more transfers financed with new liabilities. Central banks talk independence, yet the market reads the constraint. If growth slips or credit cracks, balance sheets re-expand. Foreign reserve managers adjust by diversifying settlement. Suppliers demand shorter payment terms, and households migrate to harder claims: gold, dollars, crypto, real assets. Eroding the domestic currency's role. The script does not require panic. It advances through these choices, each rational in isolation, disastrous in aggregate. The tools are better, the trade-offs are worse. The playbook has not changed, only the scale. History does not repeat in perfect copy, but it rhymes. The rhyme now is loud. We sit in stage 4, the acceleration phase, where every prior case lost control, where each round of printing required another, where inflation went exponential and the currency entered a death spiral. Maybe there is a way out. Maybe modern central banks can unwind roughly $20 trillion in freshly created money without serious fallout. Maybe a needle that has never been threaded can be threaded now. Maybe this time is different. The pattern argues otherwise. The math argues otherwise. And history, having recorded 3 prior runs of the same script, suggests we are about to relearn the same lesson the hard way. If this changed how you view what's ahead, stay focused. Because when the sequence completes, understanding what happened and why will matter. The answers sit in the historical record. And that record shows exactly where to look now.